Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us for this first of two lectures in relation to Pope Francis's Encyclical on ecological justice, Laudato Si, on care for our common home. It's my privilege. My name is Bruce Marl. I'm the chair and professor of Catholic Studies here, the Edward A. Malloy Professor of Catholic Studies here at Vanderbilt, the Divinity School, and the Graduate Department of Religion. And my privilege and joy is to introduce to you our main speaker and our two respondents. I'll do these introductions now together so that we can then just move to Kevin's talk and the two responses directly. Our main speaker is Kevin Glauber Ahern, an assistant professor of religious studies at Manhattan College, a theological ethicist. Kevin has concentrated his research on Catholic non-governmental organizations with wider interests in Christian social movements, economic justice, and ecclesiology. In addition to his fully authored book, Structures of Grace, Catholic Organizations Serving the Common Good, that book published in 2015 with Orbis Press, Kevin has also compiled or edited two other volumes, The Radical Bible in 2009 and Visions of Hope, Emerging Theologians in the Future of the Church in 2012. Both those books also with Orbis. Responding to Kevin's lecture are Professor Carwil Bjork-James from our Anthropology department, a cultural anthropologist whose work focuses on strategies of grassroots autonomy and disruptive protest in Latin America. His primary research project studies the takeover and use of urban space by grassroots social movements in Bolivia, particularly in the city of Cochabamba. Using both anthropological and historical methods, he explores pivotal public events, how they generate political legitimacy, and contribute to major, sometimes revolutionary transformations in the balances of power. His writing has appeared in such journals as Journal of Latin American and Caribbean Anthropology, the Journal of Peasant Studies, and Anthropology Now. Our other august respondent is Professor Michael Vandenbergh of the Vanderbilt Law School, a leading scholar in environmental and energy law whose research explores the relationship between formal legal regulation and informal social regulation of individual and corporate behavior. His work with Vanderbilt's Climate Change Research Network involves interdisciplinary teams that focus on the reduction of carbon emissions from the individual and household sector. His corporate work explores private environmental governance and the influence of social norms on firm behavior and the ways in which private contracting can enhance or undermine public governance. Professor Vandenbergh is a recipient of the university's Hall-Hartman Teaching Award. His courses include treatment of environmental law, energy, and property. So this is the rich fare to which we shall be treated, and I present to you Professor Kevin Ahern.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon. I was so excited when Bruce emailed me to invite me to come to Vanderbilt. I have not been to Nashville before, and I'm excited to see the city, but also excited to see such a great, vibrant divinity school where I think the struggle for justice and the relationship to religion is very, very clear here. But taking a look at the website of the university, it's also very evident that there's a lot of very interesting social initiatives happening across campus. So as someone who always needs that source of inspiration and those moments of hope, it's great to see even the posters around the hallways here where the struggle of justice is very evident in this community. So I'm very excited to be here. I'm very grateful for the two respondents from different disciplines. This shows, I think, what a university can do and should be doing in exploring these issues in a multidisciplinary approach. When Father Morrill invited me here, I told him that it's a very difficult thing for me to be drawn out of New York City on St. Patrick's Day. So it's really the appeal of one of my favorite grad professors, as well as the appeal of a dear old friend. Nicole and I have known each other for 16 years now. So I'm so glad that I'm going first. If you can make it tomorrow, she'll have an excellent presentation as well. So today we're talking about Pope Francis's encyclical, Laudato Si. And here he challenges the human family to respond to this crisis. In the text, he does not exaggerate when he writes that we as a human family are at a breaking point. The crisis we currently face extends far beyond the Google images of the lonely polar bear on the vanishing ice sheet, the summer homes on the Jersey Shore collapsing into the water, and the smokestacks that blacken the sunsets. The lifestyle and political choices that human beings, particularly those of us in developed economies, have made over the last few decades threatens the lives of millions of people, the existence of entire species, and the very future of this planetary ecosystem that we call home. This crisis, as Francis pleads, can only be reduced by our decisive action here and now. But what exactly can we do to address this crisis? With his encyclical letter, Laudato Si, on care for our common home, Pope Francis proposes an integral ecology as an alternative vision to human flourishing. Addressed to every human being on this planet, he calls upon the human family to work towards an expanded understanding of the common good by reimagining our relationships with each other, the rest of creation, and for those of us who are believers, with God. In this paper, I will explore the Pope's understanding of the common good using the traditional method of Catholic social teaching, the See, Judge, Act. After a brief introduction to the text, Part 1 will outline the Pope's diagnosis of the present crisis. Part 2 will reflect on his call to renewed relationship in light of an integral ecology. And Part 3 will conclude by highlighting ways in which we can address the problem. But first, allow me to very briefly sketch the significance of this encyclical, especially for those of you who might not be familiar with Catholic social teaching. Essentially, an encyclical, it's a fancy word for a letter, is a letter, about a book-length letter written by popes on a specific theme. It could be addressed to one person, or it could be addressed to a whole category of people. In this letter, the Pope is addressing it to every human being. Previously, popes were addressing it to just bishops, then it went to just Catholics, then it went to all people of goodwill, or all men of goodwill. Now it's addressed to everyone, even if you're not of goodwill. Since 1891, popes have used this unique genre to respond to issues of social concern about a dozen times. While there is no set canon, these documents, along with a few other texts, constitute official Catholic social doctrine, or Catholic social teaching. As such, all Catholics are invited to strongly consider the teachings within it and to reflect and to discern how they can respond to it. So it has doctrinal weight if you're a Catholic, if you're a Christian. So, admittedly, however, most Catholics aren't aware of this tradition. So it has doctrinal weight, but most Catholics aren't aware of this. It's called the best kept secret. Still, even many of us have tried to change that. After taking office, many of us in the world of Catholic ethics wondered what the Pope's encyclical would look like, his first encyclical. After all, this was the first Jesuit Pope, the first Pope from Latin America. So what would this text look like? So for those of us who study these texts, three firsts were immediately apparent about the style of Laudato Si. To begin with, instead of using the customary Latin for the title, the text uses the medieval Umbrian dialect spoken by St. Francis of Assisi. This is because he begins the text with a quote from St. Francis, who is his namesake, from his Canticle of the Sun, or Canticle of Creation. Second, this is the first social encyclical to use gender-inclusive language, believe it or not, when talking about humanity. So not just all men of goodwill. And third, it's the first major social encyclical to explicitly footnote and reference non-Catholic and non-papal sources, or non-scriptural sources. Usually, papal documents don't go down a level. They wouldn't reference bishops. They wouldn't reference other Christian leaders. This text not only does that, it cites directly, it footnotes directly UN documents, as well as a medieval Sufi mystic. So that's the style. In terms of timing, like most Catholic documents, the release of Laudato Si was both strategic and politically and symbolic as well. The document is dated May 24th, which was Pentecost Sunday last year, but it wasn't released until June 18th. Why June 18th? Well, at the Davos World Economic Forum last year, this big gathering of world leaders, Al Gore and Pharrell Williams announced that June 18th would be #Live Earth Day. They wanted a series of concerts like the Live Band-Aid in the 1980s to address the series of climate change in the lead up to the UN Summit on Sustainable Development and the Paris Conference on Climate Change. As far as I can tell, very few concerts happened on June 18th, so this seems to be the only sort of outcome of this date that Pharrell Williams and Al Gore proposed. So an interesting connection there. But it is very important because it happened in one of the most critical moments for the negotiations of the Paris Agreement on climate change. And it also happened in a critical moment of negotiating the final text for the UN Sustainable Development Summit. And many people credit the Pope's text here, along with the Holy See's diplomatic corps, as playing a critical role in reaching those agreements. Some even say the Pope was the one who saved the climate agreement in Paris last November. So its timing was very important. So in many ways, Laudato Si can be understood as a Christian response to the Anthropocene, a term introduced by some geologists to describe our present epoch where human activity is influencing the geological record. This era is marked by several alarming interconnected features. Francis begins his encyclical in chapter 1, the C stage, by laying out some of the problems facing our common home, and then in chapter 3 he goes to the human roots of the ecological crisis. So in those two chapters, you can broadly summarize the crisis as having three features. So I'll briefly go through these three features. The first feature of the crisis is has environmental dimensions. The Earth, our common home, he writes, is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth. Throughout the text, Francis is clear that this crisis is largely a result of human activity. For the Pope, climate change represents one of the principal challenges facing humanity in our day. Indeed, we do not need to look far to see the destructive impact that human beings are having on our waters, our lands, and our air. But again, this impact goes far beyond the loss of polar ice caps. For example, in chapter 1, the Pope laments the destructive impact of human pollutants on the atmosphere, the soil, and the water, the introduction of toxic and radioactive waste, the depletion and acidification of our waters, the deforestation of our rainforests, and the bleaching of coral reefs. He goes on to list the summary of sort of very depressing, sad realities of our environmental crisis. He laments the loss of the great biodiversity, what many scientists describe as the sixth great extinction, where millions of species are just disappearing because of our actions. And he says, we have no such right to do that, because those creatures will no longer be able to give glory to God. But this environmental crisis also results in a decline in the quality of human life and the breakdown of society, particularly for the poor and the vulnerable, and those on the margins of society. Human activity on the environment results in millions of premature deaths as a result of atmospheric and water pollutants. Furthermore, the growing scarcity of fresh and clean water in many parts of the world, including in cities in the United States, will continue to threaten the health and livelihood of many people and will result in rising costs of food. At the same time, rising sea levels will continue to displace millions of people in vulnerable coastal regions. I've had the chance a few times to travel to Bangladesh, and there, this is a country, a very poor country as we know, that parts of the country are facing rising sea levels, and people are being flooded out fairly consistently. Other parts of the country are facing, as the glaciers are melting, are facing periods of drought that they've never had before. And most of the country, the fresh water supplies have been tainted by arsenic. I think it's an estimate 1 out of every 5 deaths in Bangladesh now is a result of in some way resulted from the arsenic poison in the groundwater. A second factor of this present era that Francis frequently addresses in his teaching is a social economic crisis. So you have the environmental crisis, then you have a social economic crisis. This feeds into and results from the environmental crisis that we were just mentioning. The decisions made by the powerful few impact the environment of all of us and threaten the health and livelihood of the excluded, who Francis points out are the majority of the world's people. In 2013, Francis surprised many with a strong critique of global capitalism in his document Evangelii Gaudium. Laudato Si builds on this strong critique of global capitalism and links the ecological crisis to the very structure and culture of the global economy. While capitalism remains the dominant paradigm for globalization today, there are signs that it is struggling to adapt to what some have described as the fourth industrial revolution. There's talk about a post-work society. Paul Mason, for example, has a very provocative book talking about we're moving into a post-capitalistic society. Capitalism is collapsing. Whatever is happening to the global economy, it's changing. I'd invite you to look at the World Economic Forum's discussions on this past January. And if the most powerful people in the economy are worried about the change of the economy, especially for the poor and its impact on the poor, I think that really woke me up to how serious things are going to become. Although the future of the global economy is uncertain, we can be sure that the poor will likely continue to suffer. Consider income inequality, which is one of Pope Francis's major themes of his pontificate. A recent study by the British development organization Oxfam highlights the stark reality of this growing gap. According to Oxfam's report, the wealthiest 62 individuals, so 62 people that can fit into an airplane, have accumulated the same amount of wealth as the poorest half of humanity, 3.6 billion people. 62 people, 3.6 billion people. It's not just the gap has been growing substantially over the last 20 years. These imbalances, as Francis points out, are often deeply connected to a deteriorating ecological situation. It is, after all, the poorest people who are most vulnerable to environmental changes. Consider the people in Bangladesh, the people in Flint, Michigan, et cetera. So the political crisis is the third dimension to this broad crisis that Francis lays out. So environmental, economic, political. And in Laudato Si highlights a lack of leadership and political culture needed to bring about real change for people and planet. In a particularly powerful passage in chapter 1, Francis laments the failure of the international community to respond adequately and efficiently to the crisis. He writes, "It is remarkable how weak international political responses have been and the failure of global summits." When he was invited to open up the UN General Assembly, or to speak right before the UN General Assembly, he specifically he quoted this again, where he said, "It's amazing how we have failed in our previous summits. We have made all these promises and have failed to live up to them." So he goes through in the text his promises that we have made and failed up to live to. For Francis, the environmental and economic and political features of the Anthropocene are all interconnected. These three crises are sustained and perpetuated by different cultural worldviews, which seem just normal in the Anthropocene. These include a throwaway culture, which encourages people to objectify and then discard those parts of creation, including other human beings that are no longer useful. A technocratic paradigm where obsession with technology and control and progress leads individuals to perceive everything as irrelevant unless it serves one's immediate needs. And the globalization of indifference, where despite our increasing interconnectedness, we are numb to the sufferings of others. So what does Francis propose to address this crisis and its political, economic, and environmental dimensions? In many ways, chapter 4 is the heart of the text. It is here where Francis offers an integral ecology as an alternative vision capable of taking into account every aspect of the global crisis. This understanding of an integral ecology invites people to rethink our relationships, our consumer patterns, our politics, and daily life choices. Here, I believe Francis is developing the Catholic social tradition, and in particular, its understanding of the common good in a notable way. For centuries, the idea of the common good has been a central category in Catholic social teaching and Catholic social morality. Building on earlier traditions of Aristotle, St. Augustine, and St. Thomas Aquinas, Catholic social teaching has developed and expanded the notion of the common good over the past century. In some respects, it's possible to look at Catholic social teaching in 4 generations. So the first generation of modern Catholic social teaching begins in 1891 with Pope Leo XIII and his great encyclical Rerum Novarum, where he was addressing the crisis of the Industrial Revolution in Europe. Here, the common good for Leo is really a question of the local level, the relationship between the workers and the employers, and the relationship of work at the local level and the national level. Following World War II and the threat of global nuclear war, Catholic social teaching under the leadership of St. John XXIII expands the notion of the common good in this second generation of Catholic social teaching, I would argue, to include a universal dimension. No longer is the common good just possible to look, you can't just look at the common good with the threat of nuclear weapons just at the level of the nation state. You need to look more universally. And John XXIII also expands in this moment the notion of the common good by basing it very strongly in human rights and the universal, and an endorsement in Pacem in Terris in 1963 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Second Vatican Council in this period offers a strong definition of the common good, which is maybe helpful to mention, where it says it's the sum total of those conditions of social life which allow social groups and their individual members relatively thorough and ready access to their own fulfillment. So again, it's a rights-based approach that looks universally. That's the second generation. The third generation, after with the context of the late 1960s and the UN's development decade, really starts off with Popular Progressio, a 1967 document by Pope Paul VI. In that document, Pope Paul VI calls for what he describes as a full-bodied humanism. And he puts forth the idea of integral human development. So the common good is seen in this integral lens of the whole person and all people. So it's no longer just a matter of universality and basic human rights. It's trying to account for the fullness of what it means to flourish as a human being. So this integral human development. Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI continue on this integral human development approach to the common good. And they start to make mention of the environment, but it's really with Francis and Laudato Si, and what I would argue is the emergence of a fourth generation of Catholic social teaching, that we start to see the environment and the ecology brought in, and non-human creation brought in a substantial rather than an instrumental way. So for Francis, in Laudato Si, he affirms very clearly at the beginning of the text that the climate is a common good, belonging to all and meant for all. At the global level, it's a complex system linked to many of the essential conditions of human life. Later on in chapter 4, he writes how an integral ecology is inseparable from the notion of the common good. Certainly, Francis is not the first to include non-human creation in a common good framework. He is the first pope to do so, I would argue. But theologians such as Jamie Schaeffer, Daniel Scheid, and others have made similar proposals by drawing attention to what they describe as the planetary common good or the cosmic common good. In the context of Laudato Si, however, the notion, I would argue, of an ecological common good makes more sense and seems to capture more what Francis is saying. At the very core of the common good tradition is the recognition that the whole is greater than the parts. This is a central sub-theme in Laudato Si, which pays strong attention to biological ecosystems and how we are all interrelated to one another and how everything is connected. He says that about 6 or 7 times in the text. Everything is connected. We are all connected. Like all creatures, human beings are part of broader ecosystems. We depend on these larger systems that we are part of for our own existence, right? We are breathing air that has been touched by trees, and we eat and we connect to broader parts of the ecosystem. These complex webs of relationship, together with the inherent social nature of the human person, makes it impossible to address any one aspect of the current crisis in isolation. So this is good news and bad news, because if we can't address it all, we might be tempted to just give it up. So how do we find a way to address the crisis that's not overwhelming? So Francis, I think, gives us some moments for hope here, because if everything is indeed connected, that means that if we have a positive impact on one aspect, that should also reverberate into other dimensions. So it's something, I think, that is overwhelming, but also, I think, hopeful. In the face of these complex interactions and systems, an integral ecology, or an ecological common good, invites us to rethink our personal lifestyle choices, our relationships with other human beings, our relationships with non-human creation, and ultimately, for believers, our relationships with God. In calling for rethinking our place in creation, the Pope explicitly speaks of two groups that are frequently overlooked in our evaluation of the health of our current ecosystem: the poor and future generations. In the Catholic tradition, the health of the common good in many ways can be evaluated and measured by the state of people who are living on the margins of society. Indeed, these are often the most vulnerable to the disruptions in the wider ecosystems, right? So we see whenever our ecosystem is disrupted, it's the people who are, and the non-human creation at the margins, that are most, that feel the effects the greatest at first, right? So they're something that can measure the health of our ecosystem. The common good, Francis writes, immediately becomes, and logically and inevitably, a summons to solidarity and a preferential option for the poorest of our brothers and sisters. Overcoming exclusion and marginalization, he continues, is in fact an ethical imperative essential for effectively attaining the common good. So if we want to address the ecological crisis we're facing, we must also address the economic, the crisis, the reality of marginalization, questions of racism, questions of xenophobia, other questions other trends that marginalize people. So, and prevent them from participating in society. Pope Francis also speaks to the common good in relation to another category that's often forgotten, and that's future generations. Building on insights from Pope Benedict XVI, Francis clearly states that the notion of the common good also extends to future generations. Intergenerational solidarity, he writes, is not optional, but rather a basic question of justice, since the world that we have received also belongs to those who will follow us, right? This world is not ours. This world belongs to all of creation and all people, both the past, the present, and the future, right? So we can't do whatever we want with it. So this is another important contribution to Laudato Si in an economic culture often motivated and sustained by instant gratification and short-term thinking. So how do we think of our future generations? Concern for flourishing in both the present and the future is at the heart of the idea of this notion of sustainable development, which is now, with the adoption of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the central coordinating vision for the UN system. The term sustainable development was famously coined in 1987, and it was defined as the development which meets the need of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So Pope Francis here is giving a strong endorsement in Laudato Si to the whole UN agenda of sustainable development. Other popes sort of gave positive vision for that, but Francis is very clearly endorsing this initiative, where he participated in the 2015 summit, where heads of state from all over the world endorsed the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Like the idea of sustainable development, an integral ecology takes seriously the inherent worth and value of all parts of creation, from the insects living in the soil beneath our feet to the ozone in the atmosphere. By linking the common good with ecology, Francis expands the Catholic tradition's understanding of the principle to include non-human creation as goods that have dignity and worth in their own right, and not simply as instrumental goods for humans to use and then discard. Each organism, he writes, as a creature of God, is good and admirable in itself. The same is true for the harmonious ensemble of organisms existing in a defined space and functioning as a system. In other words, creation doesn't merely exist to satisfy our wants. Right? Creation, the system, the ecosystems have value in itself and from the theological Christian perspective, have a value that Christians and believers need to take seriously. In chapter 2, Francis laments those false readings of Christian theology that support human domination over the earth and gives an apology for misreadings of the Genesis creation stories that talk about dominion as being domination. But at the same time, this is not a biocentric vision of the environment that would subordinate the real needs of people to a false environmentalism. Francis is very concerned, as many Vatican officials have over the last few decades, been weary of environmental movements that would promote population control, that would promote, or some fringe movements especially. I was always amazed by how many Vatican officials were really worried about the Wicca movements and movements that would sort of promote the divinization of the earth and these sorts of things. But Francis doesn't echo those deep concerns, but rather he wants to make sure that especially the poor are not forgotten when we talk about environmental policies. He's very worried that in some proposals that have been out there for environment at some national levels have actually served to benefit people in positions of power and marginalize the poor more. So to review, with his call for an integral ecology, Pope Francis offers an alternative vision to flourishing for the Anthropocene. In so doing, he expands the traditional understanding of the common good to include non-human creation and future generations. Broadly, this ecological common good could be defined, and this is my proposal, as the sum total of those conditions of social and economic life that enable all people, and particularly the poor, and ecosystems as a whole, to flourish in the present and in the future. Right? So what we're talking about, how do we create a system, a world, a vision where everyone can flourish in their fullness, especially the poor and future generations, and the non-human creation around us. So realizing this vision that Francis puts forth will not be easy. It will demand a major paradigm shift, or what Pope Francis says in 114, a bold cultural revolution. This document is in some sense a manifesto for a bold cultural revolution. So how exactly do we do this, right? So we have this big vision, we know the problem, we have the vision, what do we do to address it? And this is the act stage, the final section of the document. In the final 2 chapters, Francis offers some helpful lines of approach. It's very interesting, in many Catholic social documents, teaching documents, popes will always call for changes. It's usually at the level of policy change, and they're usually directing it towards people in positions of political power. Francis does this, instead of having one section calling for change, he has 2 separate chapters, very robust chapters. Chapter 5 is aimed directly at the changes needed at the macro or political level. In many ways, chapter 5 is a direct message to the diplomats that were drafting the UN Sustainable Development Goals document, as well as the COP21 Paris meeting in November. In chapter 5, he begins with an appraisal of the successes and failures of previous international efforts, including the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio and other UN events that lead up to the SDGs and COP21. While pointing to the significant advances made by the ecological movement, Francis laments the failures of politics, including these previous world summits, in promoting and protecting the common good. Politics and business, he writes, have been slow to react in a way commensurate with the urgency of the challenges facing our world. Responding to this crisis means rethinking how we organize ourselves as a human family. The common good, he insists, demands that politics and economics enter into a frank dialogue in the service of life, particularly human life. This means, he writes, rethinking our outdated criteria which continue to rule the world. We need to reject, he writes in 190, a magical conception of the market, which would suggest that the problems can be solved simply by an increase in the profits of companies or individuals. We need to reject a magical conception of the market. Instead, we need to promote new models of progress that can encourage some countries to even accept decreased growth in order to provide resources for other places to experience healthy growth. So some countries need to experience decreased growth. I think he has a few countries in mind, including our own. so that other parts of the world can experience increased growth. I can't imagine another world leader saying such a thing, right? Imagine this in a political debate. As the Catholic tradition has long pointed out, a healthy and vibrant common good demands laws and political structures that are geared to promote and protect it. In Laudato Si, and later on when he addressed the UN and Congress, Francis reiterates the Catholic call to support forms of global governance. We need effective international agreements, he writes, that can regulate things that are affecting the global and the ecological common good. Global regulatory norms, he writes, are needed to impose obligations and prevent unacceptable actions, for example, when powerful companies or powerful countries dump contaminated waste in other countries. Again, there's a mirror that we all in this room can put up to what countries he's looking at. In many ways, Chapter 5 serves as a contribution of the Pope to this political process that I mentioned. And indeed, a number of parts of this are basically taken directly from Chapter 5 and put into the statements that the Holy See delegation made in these negotiation processes leading up in the summer of last year, leading up to the Paris and the New York meetings. Structures of governance and regulatory norms, however, while absolutely essential in serving the ecological common good, are by themselves insufficient in the long run to curb bad conduct, even when effective means of enforcement are present. So in addition to the changes required at the macro level, Pope Francis also calls for the needed changes at the personal level. We need a spiritual conversion. So while Chapter 5 addressed the political changes, Chapter 6 looks directly at our personal spiritual conversion that's needed to address this crisis. So he talks about an ecological conversion, a change of lifestyle. This is a challenge of education and spirituality. And here in this chapter, in Chapter 6, he's really calling educational institutions, churches, religious groups beyond the Catholic world to really find a way to step up and address this crisis. How are we educating our members? How are we inspiring a spirituality that sees our relationships in new ways? Disinterested concern for others and the rejection of every form of self-centeredness, he writes, are essential if we truly wish to care for our brothers and sisters and for the natural environment. So we need a new way of looking at ourselves, a new way of looking at others, a new way of looking at the earth. Here he believes Christian spirituality can offer a lot, especially in terms of proposing a new lifestyle marked by simplicity, humility, and responsibility. He points to the Christian Saint Thérèse de Lisieux, who had this, many people call her a little way of spirituality, where she had daily acts of kindness. So he invites people to think, how can we have these daily acts of kindness, right? There's that famous phrase, live simply so that others may simply live. Well, I think he's trying to invite us to think, how can we have daily acts in our small gestures, and he mentions recycling of paper as a very specific, concrete example to address some of these issues. And in some ways, in the virtue tradition, by doing these small acts, that will form our character. So the Catholic traditions of the common good is shaped, but there's one aspect of that I think of as framework that is lacking somewhat, and that's the space between the personal and the political. In the Catholic tradition, there's been this long attention to the idea of subsidiarity. This notion that between the person and the political, there are various levels of society: the family, unions, nonprofit organizations, universities, political parties, various other institutions that exist between sort of me and the US government, right? Whatever that is, right? So I think that space is where this change, both at the political level and at the personal level, can be most powerful and more effective. Consider, for example, all these groups of Catholic nuns, religious organizations, who have hospitals and schools. They've raised awareness to the issue of human trafficking, as well as environmental issues at the educational level, at the personal level, across the country. They've also been drawing attention to these issues in the UN system, before Congress, at the macro level, right? They function in this middle range. I think universities also can function in this middle range here, where we can play a mediating role. So for example, how do you at Vanderbilt shape the moral imagination and lifestyle patterns of students? How do you shape the moral lifestyle and consumption patterns of faculty? How do you engage the policy debate as a major institution of learning? What about your investments? What about your own institutional commitments that you have and consumption as an institution? So while Francis makes some mention of the role played by these organizations, it's not really as developed as I think it could be in Laudato Si. Few months later in Bolivia, I think you were there at the time, right? Where he addresses, or in the country at least, right? Where he addresses a movement of popular movements. And I'd like to quote his quote to this movement of popular movements, because I think here we can see what we can do as community, as communities with a lot of power. We cannot allow certain interests, he writes, interests which are global but not universal, to take over, to dominate states and international organizations, to continue destroying creation. People and movements are called to cry out, to mobilize and demand peacefully but firmly that appropriate and urgently needed measures be taken. And then he goes on to say, I would like to repeat, the future of humanity does not lie solely in the hands of great leaders, the great powers, and the elites. It is fundamentally in the hands of peoples and their ability to organize. It is in their hands which can guide with humility and conviction this process of change. In other words, we need to work together. In other words, this document is a call to action. So how are we working together? What are we doing to address this crisis? Right? So I think groups like Vanderbilt, what you're doing here in this series of events across campus is a great example. But how can we sustain this across time? How can we look at the crisis not just as an environmental issue, but also from the perspective of people who are on the margins? Whether they be racial margins, gender margins, ethnic margins, poverty margins that are very strong in parts of the world right now. So adopting this sort of comprehensive approach, I think, of the ecological common good can help us to reframe where it is that we're going. I think we have a strong sense of the problem. We have a general sense of where we might want to go. The question, how do we get there? Well, I think groups like this is a major step to do that. So I hope we can have some good conversation on this. So thank you.
Good afternoon. So I wanted to start by thanking Kevin both for his paper and for this opportunity to kind of engage with not just his work, but with Pope Francis as an individual and with this argument that's being put forward in Laudato Si, which I think is really fascinating. And I'm going to come at this from a couple different angles, and one of them has to do with the way that there seems to be a broad cultural critique that's being advanced. In this case, I'm going to pull an anthropology card and talk about culture. And the way that it intersects with both the process in like Bolivian social movement process, but maybe more specifically with indigenous peoples who are mentioned occasionally in this document, and I think actually become really relevant to it. And perhaps the backdrop for the backdrop in terms of how I'm thinking about the Catholic Church in relationship to this is that I really do see in this kind of argument, despite the fact that in some ways the Church is saying, and Pope Francis really specifically is saying, the Church needs to sort of come out of the Church into society and to have this voice on public policy issues and to very much immerse themselves in the morality of policy making around this. And definitely this isn't something new. This is something that is throughout this Catholic social tradition and this tradition of public teachings and public documents that Kevin was talking about. In that process, there's still a lot of attending to the emotional, right? And attending to the individual moral development, which I think is both really exciting in terms of some of the ways that it can implement and be a parallel to ecological action. And I also feel there are ways that it's an impediment to like richer understanding of what are the social problems that have led us to ecological crisis. Kevin talked about these three failures that Laudato Si in some ways lays out as underlying us being in this place of the Anthropocene, the existence of a throwaway culture, a technocratic paradigm that's really based on technology, on control and progress, and lastly, the globalization of indifference. And those failures all are in this interesting overlap place, right, between being structural critiques and being emotional critiques. And I felt like that's a really fascinating place to start. And in a world where there's a lot of increasing secularized consciousness that does relegate religion to a role of looking at the moral and the emotional, it is an interesting point of leverage, right, for the church to say, oh, is this what we're supposed to look at? Well, let's talk about it from that perspective, from that origin point. I feel like there's a lot of that. I also want to say that Francis is very much, especially when he's in a gathering like the World Meeting of Popular Movements, which was a gathering that was first organized, I believe, by the church in Italy, and then later organized in coordination with the Bolivian government in Santa Cruz in Bolivia. That's a place where he's not just talking about this moral aspect, right? If you look at his speech there, it's very much bound up in how do I talk about systemic change, how do I endorse social movements' effort to fundamentally change the economic and political structures of their society, and that's a part of it. That's not so visible necessarily in Laudato Si, which is more how can governments act appropriately, but when he's talking with these social movements, he's like, yeah, I really do like this idea of systemic change, and he'll have very broad-reaching goals on issues like the economy, where he said there, the economy should not be a mechanism for accumulating goods, but rather for the proper administration of our common home, right? So this is a very daring kind of proposal for change. But soon thereafter, he says also, yet there is an invisible thread joining every one of these forms of exclusion. Can we recognize it? And I was reminded of this Occupy phrase of all of our grievances are connected. But when he's seeking out roots of these things, does go to these emotional places. So when he talks about a capitalist economic system, he'll describe it in this terms around greed, right? Where he says an unfettered pursuit of money rules. The service of the common good is left behind. Once capital becomes an idol and guides people's decisions, once greed for money presides over the entire socioeconomic system, it ruins society. It condemns and enslaves men and women. It destroys human fraternity. It sets up people against one another, and as we clearly see, it even puts at risk our common home, right? And this term of the ecological common good is like being developed throughout this text, right, as a way of talking about like the planet as a whole and as a kind of nested system of ecosystems very much bound in with human lives, right? So he talks about this term, the globalization of indifference, is one where he, and this is from Evangelii Gaudium, it talks about people, and this is in Kevin's paper, and I think a footnote, so we missed it today, talks about this incapacity to feeling compassion at the outcry of the poor, weeping for other people's pain, and feeling a need to help them, right? So it's this like place of not being able to connect with the consequences of one's decisions, and not being able to connect with people who are excluded by them. And when we talk about that in terms of the poor, right, that's a way of like putting that specifically in the economic sphere. I don't know if that's the only place we want to talk about that kind of indifference. And the converse, what he was appealing to in this talk in Santa Cruz was what he called fraternal love, where he's describing how social movements carry out work inspired by fraternal love, where they see people through the eye, look in the eyes of people, see their suffering, and they list a long set of people who are marginalized. And he says, when we think of all of those names and faces, our hearts break because of so much sorrow and pain, and we are deeply moved, right? So it's this like positioning of ethics as a call to engage emotionally so as to deal with systemic consequences. And I think that's a really fascinating aspect of this kind of appeal. It does also treat institutions, say capitalist institutions in one particular case, as guided just sort of fundamentally by the wrong direction, right? But it says like, oh, it's because you're pursuing greed that you have stumbled around and created all of these problems. And I think that there's something to that, but I also think that when we look at the wide variety of political systems that have generated these like ecological catastrophes, from Western capitalism to the Soviet Union to like Maoist China to, and then looking back at this long history of deforestation, of damming of rivers, of retreat of ecological diversity in many places around the world, right? So if you take a sort of 5,000-year view instead of 500-year view on that process, then you have to ask, were all of these sort of systems just guided by the wrong emotional appeals, had the wrong idols, and they pursued them as best they could? Or, as I've been trying to grapple with my students in political anthropology this semester, is there something about the mechanization and bureaucratization of decision-making that makes one blind or indifferent, or that causes unforeseen consequences? And so that was one area where I felt like there may be something else there, and I really wish there was some grappling with that. So this speech in Bolivia is also super famous in the international press for being the one where he makes this, where Pope Francis makes this apology to indigenous peoples on behalf of the church, for where he said, "I humbly ask for forgiveness, not only for the offenses of the church itself, but also for crimes committed against the native peoples during the so-called conquest of America." And that was fascinating. And very much is, he cites something by John Paul, which is, I followed on to it and was like, gee, what did John Paul II say about this? And it was kind of like, we ask for forgiveness for everything. So this is a much more specific reference. But it was a kind of, like, he was felt hard-pressed to then invoke sort of the many good bishops and priests and laity, and to have this very odd digression about how persecution of Christians in the Middle East today is genocidal, and which is not actually a term that he then applied to the situation of Native Americans in the Americas in this speech. So that was indicative in some ways. So a couple months later, as you may know, he canonized Junipero Serra, who was a prominent priest in California, where it's very difficult to describe the conditions of the mission as anything other than sort of captive enslavement. In doing that, he talks about Junipero Serra as the embodiment of a church that goes forth, and also there's a lot of like animating joy that Francis is able to attribute to Junipero Serra in this event, where he says, "A Christian finds joy in mission, go out to people of every nation. A Christian experiences joy in following a command, go forth and proclaim the good news." So in thinking about Junipero Serra as this emblematic, interesting person, who I looked a lot into the details of Junipero Serra during the canonization, and it's when I'm convinced that he had a sense of mission. I'm convinced that in some ways there's a resonance between the kind of joy that Francis is talking about bringing to evangelization in his first, it's an apostolic letter, and the kind of, like, I do see these points of resonance, and that exact point, though, is the place where I'm most troubled by this kind of belief or argument that connects emotion and mission to consequence, right? And so the fact that there wasn't an ability to kind of, if we look at people's intents as the way to understand what it is that they do to other people or to the planet, then perhaps the intent process around Junipero Serra should stand as like a warning to us about the potential for disconnect and the need for serious institutional analysis, as Kevin Ahern was talking about, in terms of like, what is this middle level? How do we understand the presumably often not intended or indifference-based aspects of the consequences of large-scale social phenomenon that can be so ecologically destructive. So the last thing I wanted to mention was this, that this happens within a kind of worldview where particularly in Evangelii Gaudium and also in Laudato Si, there's this idea that kind of the church is in competition with relativism, right? And both like internal to the church relativism and a moral relativism within society. And I have doubts about locating, because what he'll do is say the cultural relativism is the same disorder which drives one person to the advantage, to take advantage of another, to treat others as mere objects, imposing forced labor upon them or enslaving them to pay debts. So, to me, a self-reflective Catholic who looks at who's in the Americas has to look at this process of imposing forced labor as not something that has come merely out of moments of moral relativism, but also come out of moments of moral conviction, right? Of like profound belief that one needs to bring the gospel to these benighted peoples of the Americas. And so that's a place where I feel like unraveling beliefs unraveling the structures that cause ecological damage requires cultural work. And I'm very excited about the kind of initiative to take cultural work that's going on here, but also one that needs to be a sort of highly self-critical cultural work that asks not why might others, what has led others astray, but what processes and structures lead us to implicate ourselves in highly destructive systems, destructive for other human beings and destructive for the ecology within which they live. So maybe I'll leave my comments there and hope that we have a good conversation.
Well, thank you for the invitation. This is first. Let me just say that if you haven't read the original text, it's worth it. I always recommend to my law students that we look at the original text, not just what other people write about them. By the same token, Kevin's done a terrific job here. He truly contextualized this very important work, and if we wonder, does it have an effect or not, this was given to me by one of the leading environmentalists in town, saying, you've got to read this, and I think that really brought home to me the importance of this. I also want to say thank you to Bruce, father it is as well, and I didn't
Bruce is just fine.
didn't know that, yes. And to Kevin and to Carwil for doing this program. I agreed to do this because I thought it would be just a fascinating conversation. It already has been. Also, this is a Catholic document, so let me begin with a confession. My son is the fifth Patrick in the line in my family, and I let him go out the door this morning with no green on. So if he got beaten up today, it's all my fault, and I've been a poor father. So I'm going to take this in a little bit of a different direction, particularly if I can find my reading glasses, because what I'd like to do is think about this papal encyclical in the context of new institutions that are rising up to see their role as being one to address climate change that haven't before. And I'm working on a project, as some of you know, with Jonathan Gilligan, a physicist here at Vanderbilt, called Beyond Gridlock. And we're looking at different ways to bypass the gridlock that is so deep today in American society around the world on climate change. So I want to think about Kevin's paper in the light of that. And I want to do a couple things. I want to ask, why are we worried about climate change? And just say a word or two about that, because I think it helps frame what our potential responses are. I want to look for a moment at whether the Paris Agreement solved our problems for us. If it did, right, we're done here. I'm here, so you know what my answer is going to be. I then want to ask, what role does the encyclical intend to play, and what role might the Catholic Church play in the response to climate change? And Kevin and I had a very brief conversation beforehand. I think we've got a lot more to talk about down the road on that. Clearly, one is an advocate, and as Kevin clearly demonstrated, that was an important role here. But I want to suggest that there's a different role as well. If we shift gears and we take seriously this encyclical that grows based on the notion that the common good should be seen through the principle of subsidiarity, then we also should see the Catholic Church in the light of the different roles that it plays as well, not just the different levels of society. What role does the Catholic Church play in these different levels? One is advocate, but there are other roles too that I want to get to. And if I can speak quickly enough to do so, because we've got to leave time, because I think we'll get the best discussion if we get questions out of the audience, I want to end by suggesting that an important role of the Catholic Church, maybe a role that almost no other institution can play, is to preserve the legacy for future generations. And it suggests an idea about a new institution that might get us there. So why should we worry? We hear this all the time. I don't know how many of you know, we set an all-time record, blowing the prior record by 5 or 6 degrees the other day. It hit 87 degrees in Nashville. Now, skeptics are great at cherry-picking facts, so maybe I'm doing that. But that's in the context of this last winter around the globe. Global average temperatures were 1.2 degrees Celsius higher than the pre-industrial levels. Remember that the aspiration of the Paris Agreement is 1.5 degrees, right? I don't know a natural scientist who believes that we can hit 1.5 degrees. The goal explicitly articulated in the Paris Agreement is 2 degrees Celsius, and there was even a day in the last couple of weeks where we exceeded that temperature as well. Now, that's not a global average. We're not there yet, but it just gives you a sense. What about urgency? Why should we work quickly? Costs will go up 40% for every decade. We wait. Economists at Norhouse suggest that's $1 trillion, and that's not even accounting for the human suffering and human well-being that can't be easily quantified through economics. I guess to me, what drives me most on this issue, though, is not what will happen during my lifetime, but that, as was demonstrated to me by Jonathan Gilligan when we first started working on these issues, even if we stop all carbon emissions today, sea level rises will still be increasing 1,000 years from now. So this is a problem where the people who matter most on this issue are not in this room. They are 100 or 200 times the number of people in this room. It's your offspring, and that will be irreversible. So it's the only problem I know of, other than perhaps nuclear war or maybe being hit by an asteroid, that is both more urgent and will produce more irreversible effects. That's what motivates me to be here, and what I think in part probably motivated the papal encyclical too. From what I've heard, Pope Francis met quite a bit with climate scientists, et cetera, and really was moved by that. So if you just heard the headlines from the Paris Agreement, nations strike historic deal on climate change from USA Today, nations approve landmark climate accord in Paris from the New York Times, you might say, okay, great, problem solved, let's move on to world hunger or something. But in fact, the agreement did reduce global emissions if all the countries that made the voluntary commitments were made all comply with them, many of which were contingent on other countries making those commitments. But even assuming all that, what we've done is we've looked at what will global emissions be with every country meeting every commitment at Paris versus what would they need to be at a 2C level. We call that the Paris gap, the gap between those two. And we now know that the most the international process will develop is what Paris developed, because the target is 2025. And there's no longer an international incentive to increase emissions reductions before 2025. There's a process to put new reductions in place from 2025 to 2030. And the difference is about 35 gigatons, which for those of us who are not scientists is billion tons, starting about 3.5 billion tons this year and increasing in the next decade to 6.5 billion tons. That's the difference between keeping on the 2C pathway and what Paris will deliver. So there's a great deal out there to be done, and that's in the most optimistic scenarios I can give you. So as you might imagine, we have a rule at home that I don't talk about climate change anymore, because that's as close as I get to optimism. So what about the roles of the Catholic Church? And I think, again, Kevin's paper does a terrific job of giving us some context about where the papal encyclical fits. I learned a great deal from it. And he demonstrates there that the encyclical was designed in large part to affect the Paris process itself. Then it also, of course, calls for this bold cultural revolution, which we also should talk about for the longer run. But the near-term goal was to affect the Paris process. And so in that role, that's the Catholic Church in the role of an advocate, asking government to do something different. And that's our traditional view of the institutional role of everyone but government. It's to go tell government what to do, right? And the challenge here, as you all know, is that we have a government that's in gridlock. It's in gridlock at post-Paris at the international level, too, because what we got at Paris, as I hope I just demonstrated, is not enough. So what's interesting to me in part is that when I first started hearing about the papal encyclical coming out, I think a lot about the political process and the policy process, both governmental and non-governmental. And Kevin's paper says Catholics are expected to seriously consider and respect the teaching authority of papal encyclicals. So I predicted over the dinner table that what the papal encyclical would do was put on the hook American Catholics and force them to choose between their religion, right, and their worldview. And I predicted that they would choose their worldview. And the Supreme Court's decision from several weeks ago demonstrate that I was right. Okay? So what do I mean by that? I mean that we can predict with almost certainty whether you think climate change is happening or not by looking at who you vote for, by looking at who you support. I wish we couldn't. We've done our own empirical research on this. We have to do survey after survey after survey to find a very small part of the American population that isn't predictable based on what their political orientation is. Again, I started working in the environmental area decades ago when that wasn't true, but it is true today. And unfortunately, people don't start by getting facts and then assemble a worldview. They start with a worldview and then they accept or reject facts. And so the challenge here, why do I think that I was right at my dinner table projection? Well, the principal way that the U.S. will comply with the voluntary obligation it made at the Paris Agreement, not the only way, but the principal way, is something called the Clean Power Plan. And it's a regulation that was finalized this summer and that targets existing coal-fired power plants in the U.S., accounting for 30 to 40% of U.S. carbon emissions. And that rule was stayed by the U.S. Supreme Court in an action that is unprecedented. And people throw the word unprecedented around a lot, like they throw around unique. Unique just means kind of cool these days. It doesn't mean one. By that I mean, in the 200-plus year history of the United States Supreme Court, it had never stayed a regulation at this stage, but it did so here. And I would say that every Catholic member of the court voted for that stay. So I don't understand how you can read the papal encyclical and believe that it had an effect on the most important body in the United States right now, which is the U.S. Supreme Court. So that's a challenge. That's a challenge on the advocacy side. I hope it's not a prediction about the future, but it's just an awareness that we can't just rely on these old public governance models. They may just not be enough. So let me suggest a different way to think about this. In the work that we do, given what we believe to be the urgency and the irreversibility, the priority we should give to climate change, we're looking for other things, not ways to prevent government from acting, but ways to supplement government action. And one way to do that is to look to the private sector, right? It has many of the flaws that the Pope identifies in the encyclical, and so I'm not here to defend that. I'm only here to say that it is what it is, and if we wait more than a couple of decades, the climate problem may be irretrievable. So how can we take that system and harness it to buy ourselves some time? And one answer, as it comes to the Catholic Church, is not to think of the Catholic Church in the traditional way, where it's an advocate for government change, but think of it as a source. What if we think of the carbon footprint of the Catholic Church? So luckily, I have in this room today an undergraduate who's done a brilliant job helping me think about that, Emmett McKinney. There. And in our very preliminary analysis, we say, okay, what if we thought of the Catholic Church as a source? Very hard to estimate. I'm not aware of a public source out there, but we start with things like this. There are 220,000 parishes around the world, 50,000 elementary schools, 5,000 hospitals, 10,000 orphanages, a huge supply chain, parishioners that commute to the church, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So very rough back-of-the-envelope calculation, the carbon footprint of the U.S. Catholic Church alone, just the U.S. Church, might be in the range of 50 million metric tons of carbon. That's like the U.S. iron and steel sector. Okay. What about globally? Again, even harder to estimate, but maybe in the range of 80 million metric tons. That's equal to the country of Chile, which is the 47th largest country as an emitting nation in the world. So what if we say the Catholic Church is not just an advocate of others to act, but should take responsibility for its own actions? Why not calculate the carbon footprint every year? Articulate a goal of committing to a pathway of getting to a 2C future in terms of the emissions of the Catholic Church itself? Right? And then push that out, not just through advocating government action, but through its own supply chains, et cetera. I think that's a way to help us avoid some of the easier ways of thinking where we tend to attribute responsibility to everyone else rather than taking it on ourselves. And the last thing I would say is that one of the most fascinating aspects of the Catholic Church is that it is essentially timeless. I teach property law. Much of property law emerges from the Middle Ages. Churches were used during the Middle Ages, and still are to some extent, as repositories of knowledge. Right? They're the places where documents survived through much of history. They're the place that would hold property in theory in perpetuity. Well, again, those of us in this room won't suffer the most serious effects of climate change, but our offspring and our relatives and friends and their offspring for a couple of hundred generations will. And one of the constraints here is that people in the future will have no idea what we did here today. They may for Kevin, because Kevin's paper is going to be famous, and so they'll all know what Kevin did. But for the rest of us, they won't really know. But the extent to which social norms or personal norms might constrain our behavior then is very limited when it comes to climate change. But what if what we did instead was to create a registry where all of us could record what we believed and what we did today? And in that registry, maybe we could keep it with the Catholic Church, given that it has the aspiration for sort of perpetuity. And so that your 10th relative, 10th generation in the future, or of friends or of other relatives, would know what you did today when we know what we know about the science. And my hope is that that would be, for example, a way the Catholic Church could help us give a legacy to the future that we could all be proud of. So thank you.
Well, my thanks, I think, on behalf of all of us, to our three speakers, Doctors Ahern and Bjork-James, excuse me, and Vandenbergh. And I had told Kevin that I would like to give him a chance at least to respond to 1 point each for our respondents before we then open the floor to some of your own questions.
Thank you. Well, that's great. I hope that's a sign of the conversation that we're going to have over the next few minutes. Just very quickly, the point on the indigenous people, really, really important to mention, so thank you for mentioning that. The point about relativism, Francis is doing something very important with relativism. For Pope Benedict, relativism was a very deep concern for the previous pope, for Pope Benedict. And he was thinking it much more in the context of the European context, where the number of Catholics is decreasing, sort of the relativistic culture, rise of the culture of death, various other sort of negative, sort of the church is being attacked, right? And the moral values are being lost in society. Francis, in Evangelicalium number 80, and I don't have the quote in front of me, but if I might be able to remember it, he says, even more dangerous than a doctrinal relativism is a practical relativism, where people, including the church, act as if the poor do not exist. Act as if their actions, more or less saying, we act as if what we do doesn't impact people. The people that we're using are just objects, right? It's sort of linked into that globalization of indifference and the throwaway culture. So Francis is shifting the notion of relativism in some ways, basically as a corrective to Benedict, but as a way of moving way past Benedict in a really interesting way. I don't quite know if Pope Benedict what his reaction to Evangelicalium 80 would have been, but it's worth looking at some point. Thanks, Mike, for your really call. I think in some sense what we need is a multi-stakeholder approach to this crisis. This involves our obligation as consumers, our obligation as travelers like myself. So what am I going to do with the flight ticket that I made? How am I going to make up my carbon footprint? This involves our role as where are our retirement investments invested, right? So a good example here are the group of nuns, and there were, again, I'll go back to the nuns. I taught a class last semester on nuns, and it was my favorite class I've ever taught, where a group of nuns on the question of human trafficking, for example, have used their investments for shareholder advocacy. So and the investments of a lot of institutions, including my own retirement funds, at my Catholic university, go through this social responsible investing. So they were able to levy that for advocacy on human trafficking. At the same time, they were standing outside businesses that were known, and hotels that were supporting trafficking. They were working with other organizations. They were engaging people who have been trafficked as well. It was sort of addressing the problem at various levels, right? We need to do the same with climate change, and I think parishes need to look at that. Pope Benedict tried to do that by greening the Vatican and trying to make the Holy See and the Vatican City-State as sort of the first carbon-neutral country. There's some success with that, but Francis is trying to move towards that. But what if every parish were to do that? That would be phenomenal. Really quickly, your point on the Supreme Court stay is very interesting. Cardinal Turkson, who is the head of the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace, was in New York 3 weeks ago. In an address at Malloy College, you can find this online, he made a reference to, in his prepared address, so it wasn't just a comment, to the Supreme Court stay, and then said, in the Catholic tradition, law and government exist to serve the common good. If there are laws or decisions of legal bodies, like the recent one of the US Supreme Court, that go against the common good, then what did Martin Luther King say about laws that go against that are unjust? There are no laws at all. So Turkson made the unprecedented step, a Vatican cardinal coming into the United States, critiquing and basically saying that the law, that the Supreme Court stay was an illegitimate act, which is, I mean, it's a phenomenal statement, a very political action. So I think we have action to do. So thanks, Mike.
Well, with our speaker and 2 respondents, I will be able to field any questions and comments from the floor and direct them so as to facilitate a bit of discussion as we have some time. Please.
I wanted to say to Professor Vandenbergh, well, to all of you, thank you all so much for your insights. This was wonderful and more enjoyable than I anticipated, so thank you all.
High praise.
Professor Vandenbergh, I truly hope that your work, I know you said that you hope that Professor Ahern's paper becomes very famous. I too hope that your idea in this back of the envelope calculation can gain some prominence, not just for the Catholic Church, but for many other traditions as well. I found it interesting, and perhaps we would just disagree on this, the fact that you dichotomize the worldview and the faith and sort of reference the fact that the Supreme Court had to choose between the two in deciding what to do in this particular case. And I wonder, and I sort of direct this to you, Dr. Ahern, whether or not we can recognize that many people's worldview is in many ways informed by their faith, and there are many things that we have inherited from some of the ideas that we've also retained from medieval times. One of them being this idea from Genesis 1:26. And my question is, in Pope Francis's encyclical, if you feel like he's done enough to, one, acknowledge the Catholic Church's responsibility to curb its own emissions, but then two, to go as far as to support Christian educators in unraveling within their teaching the influence of Genesis 1:26. It's not enough, I don't think, to apologize for misreadings of it. There is an ongoing tradition of indoctrination coming from Genesis 1:26, and many of us retain that idea from our youth. So I think this notion that man was given dominion is one that we might want to sort of dissociate ourselves from, but we have to recognize that it's firmly grounded in Christian tradition. I just wonder if you see enough evidence that he's attempting to unravel some of those tendencies.
Yeah, I think he's trying his absolute best to do it. I think that's why chapter 6 is so important, that other popes would have just ended with chapter 5, which is the political appeal.
Right.
But he has this whole chapter on the spiritual educational appeal. Now, many people think, Catholics and non-Catholics think the Pope has a tremendous amount of power to change everything. But there's no way the Pope can go into the grade school in New York City and change what the religious teacher is teaching that student. So that's why that middle range of actors, of social movements, of community organizations, of non-governmental organizations is not just fundamental within civil society, it's also fundamental within the church to be that middle range to take that forward. The people in positions of power, clerics and others might not be as flexible. So you need that middle range level. And I think Francis is facing a lot of opposition for his efforts to make that change. So I think it's not a question of him, it's a question of us, and it's a question of we. How do we respond to carry that out?
If I may, even though you didn't ask me to, if you would like to pursue these ideas more, we have a book coming out called Beyond Gridlock with the Cambridge Press in the fall, and this is part of chapter 8, I think. So I'd be happy to, and I made my own little email list if anybody wants an announcement. There's so few people buy books these days that if everybody in this room bought a book, it'd become a bestseller. It tells you how much money I'm going to make off of it.
Oh yeah, well those royalties.
Almost nothing, but anyway, I'd be happy to send you a notice about that. I appreciate your asking.
Okay. Yes.
Michael, I have a question for you. What organizations do you see as being most effective in working on climate change issues and drawing attention to the public? And I'm thinking maybe the Union Concerned Scientists would be one.
That's helpful, yeah. So,
What others?
and let me say one of the, just think, I think there's really interesting work going on with the political scientists here at Vanderbilt on authoritarianism versus religion, how's that affecting the presidential election. That work, I think, is just really interesting, needs to be teased apart. I don't fully understand it. In terms of organizations, number one, I tended to focus on the church as an actor here, but I believe that Kevin is right, that I don't think the Pope's encyclical caused Paris to occur, but I think it had an important effect. It helped shape the debate a little bit, and I think it caused more change in some countries than others. And so I think the Catholic Church is a very big piece of the puzzle. We traditionally think about environmental activist groups, but for change on climate change from a governmental level, we have to reach the middle and the right part of the population. And the challenge of being at universities is we're all talking to each other from the left. And, right? And meanwhile, what's the biggest major at Vanderbilt? Is it religious studies?
Poli-sci?
Economics.
Economics.
How many environmental economists are in our economics department? 0. How many environmental economics courses are taught to undergraduates? 0. Okay? So we're not talking the language of change and all that. So I think the Union of Concerned Science is very important. To me, we have to figure out how to have a broader view. We won't solve this problem from the left. We've got to figure out how to extend it. And I'll give you just the sort of paradigmatic, bad guy example, which is, which entity has reduced its supply chain carbon emissions by 24 million metric tons, according to the Environmental Defense Fund, in the last 4 years? Walmart, right? Walmart. So again, it's mind shifting. I think we have to really get out of our mindset of wanting to otherize everyone else, so to speak, and say, how do we solve this problem? Because I think it's more important than any problem but nuclear war and an asteroid hitting the world. But I'm a small minority on that view, I must admit.
Ellen?
Sounds like a good university course.
Oh, well, that's the
Come
White
take
University
environmental law
course.
too. I'd love to teach it with somebody else.
This is just a very quick question and observation. I wanted to pick up on the question of indigenous peoples and what's going on in other places. And I'm thinking back to a New Yorker article I read recently by the guy who wrote The Connection, I can't think of his name, novel, Jonathan Franzen, talking about an initiative that I can't remember where it is. This is what happens when you read these things when you're going to sleep, right? But it talked about an initiative that involved a really cool idea kind of thing. It was very local in the sense of creating this kind of preserve of sorts that also had some options for some agricultural options and job options, and it was a very creative initiative. And I guess I'm thinking too that there also needs to be, and I'm thinking back to the Jesuit past in part, and probably Jesuit present too, in terms of these deep connections that are there with Catholicism in Latin America especially, where it's on one hand you've got this picture of Catholicism as really aligned with the political elites and with the political structures, and then yet there is also this other part of coming out of liberation theology, part of it feeding into liberation theology that might be an alternative. And I'm just wondering if there's some place where those things are meeting on the ground anywhere, because what Franzen was talking about, there was no religious component to it at all. It was actually the brainchild of some, might have even been anthropologists actually, but some American academics. So I'm just wondering if there's something else going on the ground elsewhere that is we're lifting up to.
Take a look at Chiapas and the Pope's recent visit to Chiapas.
Okay.
He addresses the issue of indigenous peoples much more forcefully coming out of after Laudato Si and his address to popular movements in Brazil. He really sort of again deepens the apology more specifically, which I think your comment about John Paul II sort of was very vague and translates, but yet still he didn't get to the genocide question. So I think we still have some way to go, but there's the local church in Chiapas is very connected to the indigenous communities, and that is a long interesting tradition with Bartholomew de las Casas, who's coming into that tradition. So there's even a medieval tradition of defense of indigenous peoples, where Los Casas was a bishop who was run out of that part of Mexico by the conquistadors because he was denying communion to anyone who was mistreating the indigenous peoples. So there are historical memories that we can draw upon as resources. Why Sarah was demonized and not Las Casas, that's a different story.
Want to add anything, Carwil? Or
I mean, the one thing that I wanted to say is this is actually, like, I'm not an expert on the Catholic Church, and in Bolivia, like, it has an intermediate role. It's the it tries to position itself as a mediator between social movements and the power structure. And I don't mean intermediary, I mean, like, people were like, no, you should really sit at a table and talk. Which is valuable in its own way. But I do want to point, this is where I was trying to go with the relativism statement, which that there's a lot of people who are really super relativist in the cultural sense, for whom that kind of project, like how do we connect to, say, like ecologically sustainable, like maintaining of an indigenous territory in a way that's not dependent on extractive industries, but it allows for people to like meet their needs in a growing way over time. Like that's an ethical position. And so one of the things that I've like wanted to see more of was like going beyond we recognize there are other religious traditions that have a special ethical place, to recognize there are important other ethical traditions developing in the modern world in response, or that can serve an important role. And I think that there is a lot of like beyond the religious outreach in Laudato Si, but I also felt like that was exactly the kind of place. It's like I don't necessarily see that relativism in one. I see that relativism as often quite reaching for an ethic position.
Nicole, you want to give a comment with that, and then I see, yes.
Well, with that point, I think that maybe some Augustinian or maybe even better some Draconian caution about moral legacies should be introduced here, because Las Casas, of course, advocated for indigenous people, but also advocated for the enslavement of Black people. And Sarah, as you pointed out, had a lot of complexities, but so does Nicole, so does Kevin. We all have these complexities in our legacy. So part of the equation, and even in reading this document, I think, Kevin, where you have succeeded today in many ways, but one is to sort of show where this document is in terms of a process that I think sometimes externally from, and maybe this is good for people working within the tradition to hear, it looks like this is, the tortoise of traditions, but there's a process happening, and it is an imperfect process. But just being cognizant of, that maybe a stronger framing of sin for understanding both social but also, personal, plain old personal sin as something that influences documents and reception of documents.
So I remember immediately after Laudato Si was released, there was this whole flurry of Twitter comments and political speeches. I think it was Jeb Bush who said, "I don't get my economic policy from my phone," even though he gets plenty of other policies from his but this sort of touches on the idea of your religion influencing your worldview, as well as selecting facts to support the worldview that you've already chosen. And my question is, what is to say that Laudato Si will stick? That for those who pick and choose which parts of the religious doctrine, the biblical doctrine, and facts to inform the worldview, what is to say that they'll choose this document? And if you don't think that it will, how would we go about making it stick?
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent question, and I wish I had the solution. So Catholic social teaching has been around for over 100 years, and it's teaching on war, it's teaching on the illicit use of nuclear weapons, right, which are the countries that support nuclear weapons production, right? It's teaching on labor unions, teaching on other fundamental issues just seem to be sort of not known, which is why people say it's the best kept secret. Again, I really wonder how powerful Pope Francis really is. Now, I had a friend who works at CBS recently tell me that they run a story on Pope Francis every week. Maybe now they're running stories on Trump every week, but it's because of ratings, right? They bring in ratings. So, but how does that translate into action? That is the responsibility of, I think, all of us to make that happen and to demand accountability. But I can tell you most parishes in the United States do not have justice and peace groups as they're supposed to have. Most dioceses in the United States don't have justice and peace groups as commissions as they're supposed to have. In other continents, the church is doing a lot better job at responding to this. In Africa, in parts of Asia, in parts of Latin America, where there's a strong movement for social justice rising from below. So I would challenge students and faculty to say, why not form movements of students, even ecumenical, interfaith, abroad, that are going to really take this on, right? So what's the point of complaining if we're not able to take action ourselves? Just as an aside, I mean, I think it's very interesting when you had, in Congress, when Pope Francis was addressing Congress and really holding the congressional leaders to task, and you had behind him Boehner and Vice President Biden, and the next day, what does Boehner do? Resign. And because he still hasn't fully publicly said this, but something in Pope Francis's address led him to maybe see that his job was sort of, he couldn't do what he was supposed to do. So we really need a bold cultural revolution. How do we bring about a revolution? That's maybe a more dangerous question. But, yeah, I think it's a question of us rather than they.
And I have one quick thought on that too, which is I think it will take an intellectual revolution first on some level, and that's because he lays out a critique of the modern economic system, and I think there's a lot of validity to that. What he doesn't do is lay out an alternative and a transition to get from here to there. And those are very hard questions. It is very hard to have an economy that feeds 7 billion people, moving to 9. And there will be an enormous amount of hardship if we get that wrong, too. And those are genuine issues as well. So I think one of the things that is within the scope of the Pope, there might even be this school, I don't know if there's a school of thought of Catholic economists, but I think you now have an agenda, there's sort of a gauntlet thrown down, which is tell me how you get from a critique of the current system to a better world. It's not enough to throw rocks at the current world. I think if you really want to change it, you better come up with a better system and make it more attractive. And I'd love to see a whole development of an economics that is different, that is viable, that can survive, that can be sustainable, that can be just, but is not based on where we wish the world to be rather than where it actually is.
Sir?
Do you believe in the quote, the best way to change the world is to publicly change ourselves? And if you do, then how should the Pope do this?
Well, first off, I think he's trying himself to exhibit a new lifestyle change. So he's been, for all of his travels, he's been doing offsetting his carbon footprint, for example, trying to live a more simple and humble lifestyle. So how do we try to live a more simple and humble lifestyle, I think, is a very daunting task. If you ever watch those TV shows where they have, the house hunters, or these shows where, what do you look for in a house? And you compare, well, I need to have 3 sinks in my bathroom, or whatever it is, right? And you compare that to the realities of most people in the world. How do we find a new lifestyle that's living more simply in our daily actions? And I think Francis is calling with that chapter 6 really important. But did you have a follow-up to that? Or?
Yes. So I guess my idea is that perhaps he could call a press conference, publicly confess the sins of the Catholic Church, which of course he's doing, but making amends, which is put, as some would say, put his money where his mouth is, basically. And so with that, if you really want to change it, he would say, hey, now we're going to use our money, our power, our dollars, wherever we can, to make amends, be that with the indigenous peoples or with those who descended from slavery, and of course with the environment. So that's my idea.
That on climate is essentially what I was suggesting, is that you articulate a pathway that you wish everyone else would follow, and if they did, you could address the problem, and you start following it through your investments, through your own behavior, through how you buy goods through your supply chain. And one thing I would say, if you're an academic in the room, is that there is research that suggests that when climate scientists don't follow the implications of their own work, that people dismiss their science. So you can be the best climatologist in the world, and if you're flying a lot and everyone knows you are, it really doesn't matter what you say. People dismissed you out of the outset. And I would be surprised if that weren't true for the Catholic Church as well. I bet there's some research we could do on that.
Was there one other hand? I realize I've taken us a bit over time, but barring any. Well, my own gratitude to Kevin for traveling, and for my colleagues, Professors Bjork-James and Vandenbergh, and to make one little announcement with a view to part 2 of our Tuesday speaker series. Professor Nicole Flores, here in our front row, who tomorrow will speak on our sister Mother Earth, the potentials and problems of an ecological vision of family, with respondents coming from Peabody and from the Divinity School. So, but again, thanks to you all, and thanks to our...
Kevin.
Thank you. Wonderful. Oh, you taught me a lot. I'm very grateful to you.